So let's talk about the deployment pipeline and the reason I built it. So there are three ways that I wanted to show you how to run or host the model that we created. So number one was running like a local inference server. That's we're using MLflow to do that. We did that in one of the previous videos. And then I also wanted to show you how to host that model at scale in a cloud platform. So for example, Azure or SageMaker. Now in the previous video, I show you how to deploy the model to SageMaker. And to do that, I used the deployment pipeline, which is just a regular Metaflow flow that, depending on the parameters that you pass to it, is going to just send or create all of the resources in that specific platform that are required to host that model. And in the case of SageMaker, we created an endpoint and hosted the model there. So let me show you now that deployment pipeline from inside. Okay, so as a reminder, this is the command line that we use to run that deployment pipeline. We had to specify a target, which is where we're going to be hosting it, the name of the endpoint, the region where that endpoint is going to be hosted, and the data capture destination, which is the location in S3 where SageMaker will automatically capture all of the traffic data and the predictions made by the model, and will save them in that destination. So the deployment pipeline is here. If I go all the way to the top, this is already very familiar. So these are the libraries that we need to set up that deployment pipeline to run it. The deployment inherits from the flow mixin, which is going to give us access to the data set. The reason I want access to the data set when running the deployment pipeline is because we want to send a few samples, or I'm sending a few samples after deploying the model. I just send 3 samples to the model just to make sure the model is actually working, the final endpoint is actually working. So the properties that we can specify, number one is the endpoint. What is the name of the endpoint that's going to be hosting that model? The target platform. And as you can see right now, the code supports SageMaker and it also supports Azure. Now, I can also do the same thing with Google Cloud Platform. I can do many other ways. I could deploy this to any platform out there. I currently implemented these 2 platforms here. And by the way, if you don't specify that parameter, the default value will be SageMaker. The data capture destination URI, this is a SageMaker specific property. And again, this will tell SageMaker where to store the data captured by the endpoint. If it's not specified, then data capturing will not be enabled. So the SageMaker endpoint will not capture anything. SageMaker does that by default. And then the region, this is an AWS specific thing. The property to assume role. And in the next session, I think it's going to be the next session that I'm going to record, you guys are going to see that specific property in action. This is to assume one role and let AWS know that you want to act as that role in order to do some operation in AWS. We're going to have to use that in the next session. Then I'm going to be using here, like I did in the training pipeline, I'm going to be requiring the MLflow tracking URI to be set in the environment. So I'm going to grab it here. If it's not specified, I'm just going to be looking at localhost in order to do this. Now here, this is the start step. Let's see what's happening. Well, I'm loading the tracking URI from the environment variables. I'm logging it out, and then I'm setting it to the MLflow library that I'm importing here. I'm checking that the target parameter is within SageMaker or Azure, is one of those 2 values. If not, I'm just raising an exception. I'm loading the data. Yeah, this is coming from the mixin that we're inheriting. And then I'm loading the latest model from the model registry. Okay, this is important. So what is this? Let's go inside this function here and let's figure out what the function is doing. All right, so this function is connecting to MLflow with a client and is searching for all of the model versions that their name is Penguins. Remember, we named our model Penguins. That's how it's registered in MLflow. And we only want to return one from that search. We want to return one. And we are ordering that list by the last updated timestamp. So basically, give me a list of models, sorted down by date. The top one will be the latest one, and just give me one result. This is going to return the latest model that we hosted, that we have in the model registry. All right, so if there is no response, then we raise an exception. If there is a response, then here is the value. The value is going to be latest model. We're going to get the first item from this list. Remember, this list, this is going to be a list. We're just returning a single value. So that single value, that's going to be the latest model. I'm printing out or logging out the version on the source. The source basically is where the artifacts are located. And that is the model that I'm returning back. Okay, so that's how this function works. Very, very simple. Connects to MLflow, returns the latest version in the model registry. And after I have that, I set that as an artifact here. So it's available to my entire pipeline here, my entire flow. I'm going to node to the next step, which is the deployment step. All right, so within the deployment step, I'm going to set the tracking URI again because I'm importing the library again. I'm creating here a temporal directory, and then I'm downloading the artifacts here to a temporal directory. So what's happening is the model is hosted somewhere. It might be maybe in the cloud, wherever MLflow is hosted, right? Remember before I show you how to host MLflow locally, but I also show you how to host MLflow in the cloud, in an EC2 instance that we created in AWS. So the model is hosted there. So all of the artifacts are hosted there. But here, in order for me to deploy this model to SageMaker, I need to have possession of those artifacts. The artifacts will be like the actual weights and biases of the model and the transformers. Remember that we also submit the transformation pipelines. So the custom model can use all these three artifacts. I need to have possession of those so I can upload them back. So I'm going to download them, right? From the model registry, I'm going to download them to my local computer. I'm going to save them in this temporal directory that I'm creating here. And by the way, just Python stuff, when you do this, after I come out of this section, that's creating the temporal directory, because I'm using here with, after I come out of that temporal directory is going to be marked for deletion. So the operating system will get rid of it. Okay, so I'm going to download the artifacts from that latest model, okay? And I'm going to just save it in that directory. After doing that, I'm just creating here the path where those model artifacts can be accessed, okay? So this is just file, and then I'm putting just the name of the path /model. That's where those artifacts are being saved locally, okay? Logging that out so I know exactly what I'm getting that from. And then I'm adding that to self.model artifact. So that's going to be available regardless of whether I'm using Azure or SageMaker. That's going to be available later on. And here I'm going to say, if the target is SageMaker, call the function deploy to SageMaker. If the target is Azure, call the function deploy to Azure. So in a future video, I'm going to show you how to deploy to Azure, which is just using the same pipeline. It's going to be very simple. I'm not going to go through that code, but that code is here. It's available to you if you want it. I'm just going to go through the code of deploy to SageMaker, and I'm going to try to keep it as high level as possible. There are many, many specific details that are the way you do things is because that's the way you do things for SageMaker. That's what's really, I don't want to call it mess up, but complex about using multiple cloud platforms is that every platform does things in a very specific way, right? So if you want to deploy to multiple cloud platforms, you have to write completely different pieces of code just in order to just, bind by their rules. So I'm going to go high level to SageMaker. Obviously, the previous class that I taught here, you have access to all of that code, goes into extreme details about SageMaker because that's all that we do. But here, let's try to just keep this high level. Deploy to SageMaker here. Let's see what I do. I'm going to import a couple of libraries. This is the configuration that I'm going to use to deploy this model to SageMaker. So number one, I need to define what type of hardware I need to deploy this model, okay? And in this case, it's an ML M4X large computer. Remember that part of getting this deployment done is to request access to this type of computer. If you don't have access to this, the deployment is going to fail. So here is what I'm requesting, that I want to deploy this model on that type of hardware. I'm just going to be deploying it over one instance. You can deploy it over multiple instances, in which case you're going to have multiple computers hosting your model. It's going to be a synchronous process, meaning I'm going to wait until the deployment finishes before returning back. I'm going to be archiving the resources associated with the endpoint that became inactive because I'm updating a single endpoint. You can set that to false, and then those are not going to get archived. Again, that's just very specific to SageMaker. And here I'm going to be using tags. So in AWS, you can add tags to any resource that you create. I'm going to use tags just to put the version of the model, to tag it there, so it's clear what version from MLflow is the one that we are deploying here. Okay, so if we specified the data capture destination URI property, if we specify that, I'm going to be adding more configuration settings to this dictionary here. Specifically, I'm adding a data capture config setting, and this is what I'm going to be doing inside. Enable capture, it's going to be true. Initial sampling is going to be 100%. That means that every single request that we make to that endpoint will get captured, okay? If I put here like 80, then 8 out of 10 requests, or 80% of the requests, will be captured. Where is the data going to be saved? That's the destination URI. What do we want to save? Well, I want to save both the input data, so the traffic that goes into the endpoint, and the output data, the predictions that the endpoint makes. So I want to capture both of them, okay? And what is the type, the content type header that is going to be captured? And that's going to be text CSV and Octave Stream. And I want the content type to be JSON and Octave Stream. By the way, if you don't specify this, by default, I think SageMaker is going to capture the data in base64 or encode it as base 64. So the files are not going to be readable. You're going to have to turn that to decode that in order to process those files. By specifying this, the files are going to be readable, and it's going to be fine. All right, so cool. So that is the configuration that we're going to be using to deploy the model. And then forget about this condition here, which we don't need right now. That's going to do something very different in the case we are assuming a role. But in this case, which is most of the time, I'm just going to create, where am I deploying? What is the target URI that I'm deploying this to? And that's going to be SageMaker, and then the region. So I'm going to be deploying this, in my case, to US East 1 region. And then I'm going to call the getDeploymentClient. It's a function that, just given this target URI, is going to get me a client for me to call. This getDeployClient is part of the MLflow deployments library. By the way, MLflow supports deploying to SageMaker. It has just specific functions and whatnot that makes the deployment easier. Okay, so after doing that, I get a deployment for that endpoint. This specific function here is going to return if that endpoint exists. So if there is an endpoint that's called Penguins, this function is going to return it back, right? And I can just decide whether I want to update it or not. But if it doesn't exist, this is not gonna work, right? So if this deployment does not exist, it's gonna raise an exception, in which case I'm gonna call the function create SageMaker deployment, okay? But let's assume it exists. Let's assume the deployment already exists. So there is an endpoint that's called Penguins. Then I'm going to just check the version of the model. So I'm going to check the tag. Remember that we added this tag with that version, okay? So let's say there is an endpoint that's running version 5, and I run the deployment pipeline, and the latest version of the model in the model registry is model 5. So at the time of deploying, well, the endpoint already exists, and the endpoint is already running version 5. So I don't have to do anything in that case because I'm already running the latest version. So that is a protection that I built here in the code. So I do not update an endpoint and, go through the entire process of updating an endpoint if there is no reason for it. Okay. So that is what this condition is doing. Okay. If not, if the version of the model is not the same, then, I'm going to call the update SageMaker deployment. Okay. So let's see what these two functions do, the update SageMaker and the create SageMaker. Let's just go. Oh, by the way, this function is SageMaker model running. This is the one that I passed just the deployment, and it's going to check. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of the details, but you can see here, I get all the way down until I get the tags. Here is where I get the tags. And then for the tags, I'm just going to find the version tag. And then I'm just, if I find a version tag that's the same as the model version that comes from the model registry, then I'm just going to return the model. If not, I'm going to return no. So that's what this function does. All right. So the create SageMaker deployment, so it calls this, the create deployment function. Now I'm passing the name of the deployment, which is going to be Penguins, is one of the parameters. The model URI, which is basically the location, the file location where the artifacts are. Remember, the artifacts are going to be local in my computer. I downloaded them to a temporal directory. The flavor of that model, which is a Python function. This is a custom model, and MLflow calls them Python models, Python function. And the configuration of this deployment. That's it. Everything that needs to happen for SageMaker specifically happens behind the scenes of this create deployment function, because MLflow provides that and wraps the functionality of SageMaker behind this function. If MLflow doesn't provide a specific functionality for a cloud platform library, you're going to have to use their API. There are things here that I need to use AWS's APIs in order to do. Like, for example, if I go up here in this function here, which is SageMaker model running, notice that I'm calling get Boto3 client. This is just going to connect to the Boto3 library or use the Boto3 library to give me a SageMaker client. That's their AWS API to do this type of stuff. The reason I have to go directly with their API is because MLflow is not helping here. So it's not giving me anything to go off of. So, but the deployment part is already provided by MLflow, so it's very simple. Parentheses, in order to create an endpoint in SageMaker, you usually need to create 3 different components in AWS. One component is what they call a model. Then you need to create an endpoint configuration, and then you need to create the endpoint, and you have to connect all 3. Here, we didn't have to do that again because all of that is hidden from us, all of that complexity, which is great. All right, final function that we're going to look at is the update SageMaker deployment function. And here is just, instead of calling create deployment, I'm going to call update deployment. Something that is very, very important is that in the case of SageMaker, let's say you have a model running and we have a new version and we want to update that model. That update is going to have, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take about 5 minutes for SageMaker to completely do the update, but there is 0 downtime. What that means is that customers can still use your endpoint, even though that endpoint is going to be updating, right? So SageMaker will take care behind the scenes of swapping out everything that needs to be swapped out and move the traffic over to the new model, and you are not going to have any downtimes, which is amazing. Okay, it's one of the reasons you want to use these big cloud providers, because they do that type of stuff very, very well. All right, so let's go back to the step. The deployment step is right here. So as you saw, if the model exists, I update it. If it's not the latest version, if it doesn't exist, I create it. Here is how I create it. Let's go to the deployment step. Where are we? Okay, so it was right here. Depending on the target, I went to deploy SageMaker or I went to deploy Azure. Finally, I'm going to call self.inference, which is just a step that is going to send like a few data samples to that endpoint. In this case, notice that here I'm getting 3 samples from the data set, 3 random samples from the data set. I'm getting rid of the label column, which is the species column, and then I'm resetting the index and dropping it. So I don't need the index of the data set of those 3 samples. So here are my samples, and I'm just going to pass them to either run SageMaker prediction or run Azure prediction. Okay, so let's go and see what this function does. Run SageMaker predictions. What am I doing here? All right, so I'm getting the deployment client to the deployment target URI. As a reminder, this is SageMaker column/US is 1. And then I'm calling the function predict. Name of the endpoint. So I'm going to that deployment, the one that's called Penguins, and here is the samples, basically a data frame of samples. And then I'm getting the response that comes into predictions. I'm just creating a data frame out of the response, and I'm logging it out. So you see, hey, these are the predictions of the 3 samples that you sent. Very, very simple. I think that was the last step before end. Let's just make sure that was the case. If I go up, yes. So after running inference, I go to the end step where I'm just saying the end. So just nothing here. That was it. So this is the deployment pipeline. So if I wanted to create the ability for this deployment pipeline to deploy to Google, the changes that I will need to make is, number 1, I will need to add support for it in the target parameter. So the target parameter should support passing Google to it. And then I will need to create the functions, the corresponding functions to do that deployment to Google, maybe to run the model as, I don't know, maybe a Cloud Run. A Google Cloud Run, or you run it there, instance there. So that is something that you maybe want to look into. But yeah, it should be very simple. And then this pipeline will help me deploy the model anywhere I want it to. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.